They never wanted silence, not real silence. They wanted control dressed as calm, order packaged as peace. But when everything started to shake, when their plans bent under their own noise, they didn't expect someone like me to stay still, to become still. I didn't quiet the room with force, I just didn't play along, and that's what broke it. At first, they kept talking, louder, faster, thinking noise could drown discomfort. But the louder they got, the more obvious it became. They weren't building anything. They were covering something fragile. Something that cracked the moment it was no longer echoed. And I was the echo that never came. They asked me to contribute. I didn't. They asked me to react. I didn't. They asked me to care. I smiled, not wide, not kind, just enough to let them know the game they thought they were running had already collapsed. I didn't flip the board. I made them realize the board was cardboard soaked in gasoline. They tried to isolate me, said I wasn't a team player, that I didn't align, that I didn't support the tone. And that was the moment I knew I'd already won. Because when your silence becomes threat, it means they've run out of louder weapons. I didn't kill the noise. I just gave it something it couldn't compete with. Me. They started whispering, not because they had secrets, but because they weren't sure what I could hear. Funny how silence turns into paranoia when it's not yours. I didn't have to say a word. They filled in the blanks themselves, made up versions of me that were sharper, colder, more dangerous than anything I ever offered. I watched them rephrase their sentences mid-air, watched them question each other's confidence, hoping someone else would carry the certainty they'd lost. But no one did. And me, I just leaned back, still, grinning, not with joy, but with recognition. I knew this game. I knew how sound collapses when it's no longer echoed back. They thought I was ignoring them, that I didn't care. But it's worse than that. I heard every word, I just didn't move. And there's something cruel in that, isn't there? Not reacting, not because you're above it, but because you're under it. Deep enough to know the ending already, deep enough to wait for it. Their strategies kept shifting, meetings got longer, voices got thinner. They couldn't pinpoint what had changed, but they all felt it, a tension with no direction, like standing in a room with gas in the air and not knowing who's holding the match. I wasn't holding it, but I was smiling, and that's what scared them. They started using my name differently, not as address, as warning. Let's not do what he did. Don't go quiet like that. I had become a reference point, not for rebellion, but for exposure. I didn't break anything. I didn't need to. They broke themselves trying to prove I was wrong, and finding out I wasn't even playing. It wasn't silence anymore. It was gravity. It bent the tone of the room, slowed their words, softened their energy. Every time I entered, it was like time clicked into something colder, tighter. like the volume of reality turned down 2 notches and no one could find the dial. I didn't plan this, that's the joke. I never made a strategy. I just stopped pretending their noise meant something. And when I did, the rest unraveled. Their hierarchy, their confidence, their little rhythm of performance, all of it depended on being believed. I stopped believing, and everything collapsed. They called it passive aggression, cute term. But it was neither. I wasn't aggressive, I was finished. And I wasn't passive, I was awake. The only one in the room who realized that every word spoken in fear of silence is already a surrender. They were loud, they were united, they were organized. But I was quiet, and I didn't need them. They began to shift their behavior, not openly, quiet corrections, shorter replies, tones that trailed off mid-sentence. You'd think they were adapting, but they weren't. They were collapsing inward, adjusting not to the situation, but to the absence of reinforcement. They were used to pushback, not absence. And in absence, every sentence starts to rot. They hoped I'd flinch, that I'd finally feel the cold I created. But cold doesn't affect the one who set the temperature. I wasn't punishing them. That would mean I cared enough to balance something. I didn't. I just stayed. And that ruined everything. You see, noise requires response, attention, engagement. Even anger feeds it. But when you offer it nothing, it begins to suffocate on its own echo. And that's what they felt now. Not conflict, but slow asphyxiation. The kind that comes not from pressure, but from the lack of it. I became the quiet they couldn't interpret, and that terrified them. Because once something loses its label, it becomes uncontrollable, and people fear nothing more than the uncontrollable in a human shape, especially when it doesn't need to raise its voice to end theirs. I wasn't outside the system, I was the system with the volume turned off. And they were shouting into their own reflection. Now they began editing themselves before speaking, not out of strategy, out of fear, not of me, of what they'd sound like when I didn't respond. That's the thing no one prepares for. Reactions are easy, predictable, but when the only answer is nothing, every word starts to feel like a mistake made in public. They lowered their eyes when I looked their way, not because I was intimidating, but because I was intact. And wholeness in a space built on noise becomes violence. I didn't smile to provoke. I smiled because I'd seen it all before. Desperation dressing itself as professionalism. Chaos pretending to be collaboration. It never lasts. You want to know what ends noise? Not silence. Indifference. Not the kind that ignores, but the kind that absorbs. That listens fully, remembers deeply, and still doesn't move. That's what they feared. That I heard everything and chose not to react. They said I was difficult, disengaged, but they kept checking for my reaction. That's the twist. They needed me to care so they could justify their noise. I took that away, and without it, They were just movement without meaning, sound without center, echoes chasing themselves in a room I never left. And if you're still here, it means you don't need the noise either. Subscribe and let silence do the talking. They started checking my face before they spoke. Adjusting tone, phrasing things like questions even when they weren't. Not because I held rank, not because I demanded respect, because I became the mirror none of them wanted to stand in front of. And when mirrors don't reflect noise, people start to question if they're even visible. They began overcompensating, filling the room with new frameworks, new rituals, new slogans, as if louder structures could drown out the silence between them. But structure without presence is just choreography. And when no one believes the dance, the rhythm dies quietly. I wasn't leading. I wasn't correcting. I was simply unmoved. And that unmoving shape, the constant, became their unspoken north. Not one they wanted, one they needed because everything else was spinning. And that's the cruel part. I didn't ask to be their anchor. I just didn't drift. And now they hated me for it. They whispered about motive, projected rebellion, imagined insult. But I'd given them nothing, no reaction, no hint of resistance. And that's what turned them frantic. Not that I had said something wrong, but that I had said nothing at all, and it was still more powerful than everything they had built. Noise doesn't die when you fight it. It dies when it sees you're still breathing without it. They started building explanations around me. Theories, narratives, not about what I said, but about what I might be thinking. Maybe he's testing us. Maybe it's a tactic. Because admitting that I simply didn't care would be too destabilizing. People would rather face a manipulator than a mirror. They looked for reasons, said I was burned out, misunderstood, maybe even depressed. It was easier to humanize my silence than to realize it wasn't weakness, it was distance. And distance without apology, that's where people panic. They kept inventing new roles for me, roles I never played. He's the observer, the quiet genius, the misunderstood outlier. No, I was none of those things. I was just done pretending their volume meant relevance. What scared them wasn't what I'd become. It was what I stopped being. They didn't miss my input. They missed what it made them feel. Validated, necessary, important. And now they couldn't unhear the echo of my absence. I wasn't the silence between ideas. I was the silence after truth. The kind that doesn't wait for applause. The kind that just stands and stays. They no longer addressed me directly. I became part of the background, visible, unavoidable, but untouched. Like a portrait no one dares to move, not because it's sacred, but because no one wants to be the first to admit it sees more than it shows. They adjusted schedules, changed formats, shortened meetings, all to avoid the long stretch where my silence used to sit. They thought they were fixing the system, but they weren't fixing anything. They were dodging the only presence that didn't need fixing, and that meant confronting what actually did. I wasn't quiet because I was broken. I was quiet because they were. And when the broken speak too long, even noise becomes grief. They had filled every inch of the space with sound and still couldn't find clarity. Then I sat still, and the echo of that stillness said everything they were afraid to face. They started asking each other questions they used to ask me, then stopped asking altogether, because without a reaction, dialogue feels like begging, and pride won't beg, not out loud, so they swallowed it, let it sit, let it rot. What broke them wasn't silence, it was knowing someone else could live inside it, comfortably. No one tried to confront me anymore, not because they'd accepted me, because they'd abandoned the idea of changing me. They realized the weight I brought wasn't in argument, but in inertia. I didn't push, I absorbed. And when something keeps absorbing, eventually even noise turns inward. Now they only spoke when necessary. Small things, transactional, mechanical. Their voices had shrunk into tools, and tools don't ask for purpose, they just act. The room had lost its pulse, its rhythm. What was once a loud, chaotic current was now just flickers, nervous light, controlled tremble. I hadn't taken the energy away, I'd just never given it back. They kept pretending I was temporary, a phase, a shadow passing through. But I wasn't. I was the environment now, not a storm, just gravity. And gravity doesn't demand, it waits. One of them looked at me once, long enough to almost say something, then didn't. That's how you know something's over. When even the impulse to explain disappears. I didn't ask for power. I became what power turns into when it no longer needs permission to exist. They stopped seeing me. I was still there. Same seat, same posture, same silence. But their eyes adjusted to absence. Not because they'd forgotten, because it hurt less to pretend I wasn't part of the equation anymore. I didn't respond to their performance, and over time they stopped performing. The noise had nowhere left to echo. What remained was structure without voice, a theater with no actor, no audience, just stage lights humming over dust. And yet I stayed, because that's the truth they never faced. Silence isn't what happens when sound ends. Silence is what survives after meaning dies. They said nothing, I said nothing, and still I won. Not because I destroyed their system, because I outlasted their illusion of control. They wanted feedback, validation, friction. I gave them nothing, and nothing became louder than all of them combined. That's what they fear, not rebellion, not resistance, just this. Someone who doesn't need to speak, to end the conversation.